Dante's Boxing Nation, what's going on, guys? Well, it looks like the exchange of fighting words have already started when it comes to Gennady Golovkin and Danny Jacobs, who will most likely be facing each other in their very next fight, since the WBA has already ordered this fight. For those of you guys who don't know, Danny Jacobs is the regular WBA champion, and Golovkin is the super WBA champion, or however they explain that situation. But anyway, like I told you guys, Danny Jacobs and Gennady Golovkin, they exchanged a couple words on Twitter. This is what Jacobs had to say to Gennady Golovkin. Quote, "Never ran, I never will." Golovkin, this is what he said in response. "Daniel Jacobs, then you should already start practicing, and while you are dancing, do not forget to practice signing contracts. Hashtag Triple G Jacobs." End quote. So, like I said, guys, the talk has already began, and I truly believe this is the next fight. I don't believe that Danny Jacobs is going to go out like Canelo Alvarez and give up his belt just to avoid a Gennady Golovkin fight. I believe that Danny Jacobs, he felt that he was ready for Gennady Golovkin after he knocked out Sergio Mora, even before that. After watching the Kell Brook fight, of course, that just heightens Danny Jacobs' confidence when it comes to defeating Gennady Golovkin. This is a really good fight. It's a very competitive matchup. This is a step in the right direction for Gennady Golovkin when it comes to proving that he's one of the best fighters in the world. Now, don't get me wrong, this is not on the level of a Kovalev-Andre Ward, because in that fight, both fighters are considered pound for pound, top 5, the best fighters in the world, going up against each other. When it comes to Danny Jacobs, we all know Danny Jacobs is not considered top 10, pound for pound, one of the best fighters in the world. But he definitely will be pound for pound one of the best fighters in the world if he beats Gennady Golovkin. But that'll definitely be a tall order for Danny Jacobs, because for those of you guys who don't know, he does have a loss on his record. Not only does he have a loss on his record, but he has a knockout loss against a guy named Dmitry Pyrog. Going into that fight, Pyrog was undefeated, and I haven't actually watched the fight yet. I just read the reports on the fight, and from what I read, Pyrog, he not only knocked out Jacobs, but he dominated the entire fight. He also knocked down Danny Jacobs in the second round, and according to reports, he applied a lot of pressure on Danny Jacobs. So that's pretty interesting. I mean, there's a lot of questions. Did Danny Jacobs become a better fighter since that loss? Did he learn to deal with pressure since that loss? Because what this fight is going to come down to is who deals with pressure the best. Because Gennady Golovkin, when it comes to him, he's made it very clear that it's actually safer to stay close to Gennady Golovkin as opposed to staying away from Gennady Golovkin. If you give Gennady Golovkin the distance and the range that he wants or he needs to extend his punches, then you're in trouble. If you lay on the ropes, you're in trouble. What you would need to do is try to put Golovkin on the ropes, something that no one has ever done before, because I doubt Golovkin would be as comfortable on the ropes as a Floyd Mayweather or a Roy Jones Jr. That's why we've never seen him on the ropes. Okay? So that's basically what this fight comes down to. It comes down to who's going to be more comfortable dealing with pressure. And we've already seen, once again, Danny Jacobs get knocked out by a power puncher. But at the same time, we have also seen Gennady Golovkin look very vulnerable against pressure fighters who did not have power, or not the same type of middleweight power that Golovkin has. Willie Monroe, he was a fighter that stood his ground, and he fought Golovkin back, and he had a little bit of success. And we just seen what Kell Brook just did. You know, Terrence Crawford, when I interviewed him, he said something pretty interesting when it comes to Gennady Golovkin. He says, well, he's definitely a hard puncher. He looks very strong, but we don't know how good he is until we see him in the ring with someone who's going to fight back. And what that basically means is a guy with the confidence of a Kell Brook, a guy who stands his ground and he's letting his hands go. But not only is he only letting his hands go, he also has the hand speed to confuse and keep Golovkin honest. Because you see, if you guys notice, when the much slower Dominic Wade was attacking Gennady Golovkin, he was countering Wade. Because believe it or not, Golovkin was quicker than Dominic Wade. But when Golovkin was in the ring with Kell Brook, it was Kell Brook that had the majority of the speed. So it looked to me like Golovkin didn't know where the punches were coming from. So instead of him trying to counter, he would just stand there like a sitting duck and block. All right? It was because of the speed and the natural athleticism of Kell Brook, a combination that Gennady Golovkin was not used to. Matter of fact, I had a real long 45-minute interview with Golovkin's trainer the other day, Abel Sanchez, and we talked about this Danny Jacobs fight specifically, or at least later on in the interview. And Abel Sanchez, he asked me, he said, you know, tell me, what do you think about Danny Jacobs? And I told Abel Sanchez exactly what I'm telling you guys right now. Well, actually, I said a little bit more. I told Abel Sanchez that I believe Danny Jacobs is athletic just like Kell Brook. The difference is Danny Jacobs, he has middleweight power and he has the speed and agility to go with it as well. I told him, I said, the only question mark with Danny Jacobs is his chin. How does he take a punch? Because he has been knocked out before. And this is when Abel Sanchez, he said to me, well, yeah, that's true. And he said, that's a good assessment. But then he brought up Curtis Stevens and he tried to compare Curtis Stevens to Danny Jacobs when it comes to athleticism. He said, well, Curtis Stevens, he was athletic too. And I said, to a certain extent, he was athletic, but his style was the complete opposite of a Daniel Jacobs. Because Curtis Stevens, he's short, compact, much shorter than Gennady Golovkin. He only comes forward and he relies on trying to land his big knockout punch, which is his left hook. I believe it's his left hook, his left or right hook, one of those hooks. But that's a different style completely than the style that Danny Jacobs possesses. Danny Jacobs is taller than Golovkin. He can fight on the outside. He has foot movement. He's not going to just fight one way. So it is a big difference. The only thing Danny Jacobs and Curtis Stevens have in common is both of those guys were knocked out before they had even fought Gennady Golovkin. That's the only thing they really have in common. And speaking of this interview with Abel Sanchez, I just want to say this to the new subscribers on my channel, because I know when you guys subscribe and you're new, obviously you probably haven't seen some of my older interviews and videos, etc., etc. I say this because I had one person who commented and he was like, hey Dante, how come you didn't bring up Edeslani Lara? How come you didn't bring up Andre Ward when you were talking to Abel Sanchez? I want to let you guys know I have already done that with Abel Sanchez. I've interviewed Abel Sanchez probably about 10 times, and I'll try to compile all of the links and the interviews and put them in the description box, because once again, like I said, I've already asked Abel Sanchez, why are you guys facing Willie Monroe, who has a style identical to Edeslani Lara? Why wouldn't you just fight Lara, who's already the bigger name, has already fought on pay-per-view? Why wouldn't you fight him and fight Willie Monroe? And this is all on tape. I'm asking Abel Sanchez this, and you know what Abel said to me? Matter of fact, I asked him the question. I said, who would you say is a bigger star, Monroe or Lara? He told me that Monroe was a bigger star than Lara, which clearly tells me that Team Golovkin had no interest at all in facing Edeslani Lara. And then even after, what was it? Let me think for a minute. When was that? Oh yeah. Even when Gennady Golovkin officially signed a contract to face Kell Brook, I called up Abel Sanchez, and one of my first questions was like, how come you guys didn't fight Edeslani Lara? You know, I mean, if you're going to fight a guy who's coming up in weight, why not fight a junior middleweight like Edeslani Lara? Already has a name, once again, already fought on pay-per-view. Why not him? And Abel told me, oh, we didn't have the time, you know, it was short notice, etc., etc., etc. I've also talked to Abel Sanchez about Andre Ward. I've done plenty of interviews where we talked exclusively about Andre Ward. So once again, I'm gonna put together all of these clips. So, you know, some of my new subscribers, you can watch some of those interviews and hear us discuss things that you guys are interested in hearing. Also, if you guys have a question that you want me to ask Abel Sanchez, feel free to put it in the comment section, especially if it's a question that I haven't already asked Gennady Golovkin or Abel Sanchez. Now, something else I wanted to mention, speaking of Abel Sanchez and me talking to him, you know, Abel Sanchez, he also sends me text messages every now and then, and we'll go back and forth and have a conversation. Abel Sanchez, he sent me a text and he asked me the question. He said, how many fighters do you know that have been this dominant in the middleweight division? Obviously, he's talking about his charge. And he was like, how many fighters do you know that have been this dominant in one weight class in the middleweight division? And I said to him, I said, you know, Abe, there's no doubt about it. Golovkin, up until this point, he's been dominant in the middleweight division. But I said to him, I said, Golovkin needs signature wins, though. He needs an equal. He needs great fighters, need great opponents. This is why Sugar Ray Leonard is remembered. He's remembered because of the guys that he faced, right? Sugar Ray Leonard, he had Hagler, he had Hearns, he had Durant. Floyd Mayweather, he had Manny Pacquiao, he had Mosley, he had De La Hoya, Diego Corrales, Castillo, etc., right? And all of those fighters I mentioned, except for Oscar De La Hoya, all of those fighters I mentioned were considered pound for pound one of the best fighters in the world. Shane Mosley was considered the #1 welterweight in the world after he knocked out the #1 welterweight, Margarito. Okay? These are the type of guys you need on your resume when it comes to Gennady Golovkin. Abel Sanchez, he compared Gennady Golovkin to Bernard Hopkins. And I told him, I said, when it comes to Bernard Hopkins, you have to remember, Bernard Hopkins, he had a lot of signature wins in the middleweight division. And when he moved up to higher weight classes, he had a lot of signature wins. One of the best wins Bernard Hopkins had in the middleweight division was beating the hard punching, undefeated at the time, Felix Tito Trinidad. Trinidad at the time was a huge favorite to knock out Bernard Hopkins, okay? So that just lets you know what type of competition Hopkins was in the ring with. He was in the ring with a guy that was favored to not only beat him, but knock him out, all right? On top of that, Bernard Hopkins, he also unified the belts because he was in a tournament that was similar to the Super 6 tournament. He unified the belts. He had to beat another really good middleweight champion that was undefeated at the time, and that was Keith Holmes. Bernard Hopkins, he knocked out fighters like the undefeated Joe Lipsy. Joe Lipsy, see, this is back in the Tuesday Night Fights day. Joe Lipsy was an undefeated, vicious, aggressive knockout artist with speed, power, agility, etc., etc. Very good fighter. He ended up challenging Bernard Hopkins for the title, Bernard Hopkins knocked him out. And I'm only naming a small percentage of the big names that Bernard Hopkins faced. So the point that this is all this stuff I just said to you guys, I said it to Abel Sanchez by way of text. I also sent Abel Sanchez some links of fighters like Bernard Hopkins. Since he brought up Bernard Hopkins, I sent him a link of Bernard Hopkins basically criticizing Gennady Golovkin by saying that Golovkin, he should do what I did. I moved up 2 weight classes, fought Antonio Tarver. I sent him links of Bernard Hopkins saying this. I sent him links of Roy Jones saying this. And I told him, I said, tell me what you think. And, you know, he sent me a text back and he basically just tried to discredit some of the wins that Roy Jones and Bernard Hopkins got when they moved up in weight. But the bottom line is we had a real good conversation, and I want to have this same conversation online next time on the phone. So we'll do that. But, you know, going back to Danny Jacobs, once again, I'm not ready to pick somebody when it comes to who wins this fight. Matter of fact, I mean, I may slightly be leaning towards Golovkin right now, but that may change because it's early right now. I want to see how these guys look when they train. I want to see how strong they are mentally going into this fight. So we'll see. We'll see what happens. But once again, this is not a pound for pound type of fight, at least for Golovkin in terms of his opponent, but it is a step in the right direction. This is definitely a bigger fight than, or a more impressive win than beating the welterweight champion Kell Brook. This is a much more impressive win than beating Dominic Wade, because Danny Jacobs, he earned this spot. He won his playoff fight by beating Peter Quillin. And that's what catapulted Danny Jacobs into the semifinals against Gennady Golovkin. We'll see what happens. We'll definitely see what happens. That's all I got for now, guys. I'm on to the next one.